Right.
Olivia. Well, good morning, everybody. Hopefully, we'll have more join us today, but happy Wednesday hump day. I know a lot of people don't say that anymore, so I guess I'm dating myself. But I'm Shay Cook. I am the CEO and founder of Crusaders for Change, but I'm also the chair of the board of directors for Central Maryland Chamber. So I welcome you here. Hopefully, everybody's well and doing okay. If not, we'll definitely praying for you and your family because you know the reality. It's hard times, but we're here to support each other. And that's one of the reasons why we're having this workshop to talk about our DEI toolkit and go into even more. We got a great workshop for you today. Also wanted to point out our CEO, COO for Crusaders for Change, Vanessa's on the line. So thank you for joining us. And also want to shout out Sonia for connecting us with Dr. Brown and recommending we move forward with her and inviting her and Denise and Dr. Boston to this great workshop. So Dr. Denise and Boston and Dr. Pam Brown, as they like me say, Denise and Pam. Dr. Denise Boston is the manager of the Equity and Restorative Practices Unit, and Dr. Pamela Brown is executive director of Anne Arundel County Partnership for Children, Youth, and Families. So before we get into our presentations, and I'll give you a little agenda after that, I wanted them to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their story and why they entered into this work. So I will pass it on to Denise.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, I'm Denise Boston. And as Shay said, I'm the Howard County Equity and Restorative Practices Manager in the Office of Human Rights and Equity. So many different titles. I'm also a professor of psychology at Trinity University in Washington, D.C., teaching expressive arts therapy. My story, wow, to be brief and succinct. My parents moved from Baltimore to Howard County in 1970. So I was here during Ross's time of designing Columbia. I'm a product of his dream. My father was able to buy a house here with no problem. Coming from Baltimore, he wanted a place to live central. We're from Baltimore. I'm like 3-4 generations Baltimore. But my father was working in Washington, D.C. and was looking for a place because redlining was part of our story in Baltimore at the time. He wanted to live in a place where he felt like he could buy a home, feel safe, great education for his children. And my mother didn't want to move to Washington, D.C., where my father was working. So Columbia was the place at the time. It was woods. There was no mall. It was only 29, 2 lanes. I'm really dating myself, but that's okay. I feel good about my age. We moved here. We were, a few Black families who had moved into Columbia at that time. There were Howard County Black families that were here, but Columbia families that were moving in, there were very few Black families at the time. So I attended Mount Hebron High School. I attended Wild Lake, that was just built, the first Wild Lake High School. And then I graduated from Howard High. My father ended up buying a second home for my mom. They lived a great quality of life here. But what my experience from being kind of the inaugural family moving here was I saw a lot of disparities. Even with, how wonderful the county was and how Howard County was building and had a sense of, it was really interracial in its kind of presence of mind. But my father only went to the 8th grade. And so he was very fortunate to work with the Army Corps of Engineers. He lied about his age when he went into service. He said he was 18 when he was really 16. But he had tenacity. He had drive and determination. And he was living under the radar here because most people that were moving to Howard County and Columbia, more specifically at that time, had doctorate degrees, had degrees in engineering, had their own businesses. My father didn't have, and no one really saw him because he was invisible here. He was privileged with having a home, but because he didn't have education, he never felt like he lived up to the standard. That had an impression on me growing up here. And I went off to college. My brother didn't get a chance to go to college, but my sister went to Morgan. I went to school in North Carolina. My father made sure we had a college education because he never had a chance to have. But I always had in the back of my mind, what does Howard County really mean to the citizens living there? Is it equitable? Is it just? Is it fair? If you didn't have credentials, if you didn't have an opportunity to be part of a fraternity, if you weren't part of the NAACP, people came here to be part of a collective. My father didn't know how to do that. What he did know how to do was to buy a home and to keep a home and to raise a family. So that's my background of this work. And I went on to be a professor of psychology with an expressive arts therapy underpinning, where I saw arts as a way of healing. I've done a lot of research, and Pam will talk about her research and the work that has been doing around data gathering. That's my background as well. And I came into this position. This is an inaugural position the County Executive Ball placed. I'm the first to be in this position. And it's an honor to be doing the work around equity, diversity, and inclusion in Howard County. So I'll leave my story there.
Thank you, Denise. That's powerful. And I really appreciate you sharing your story there. Quick, but very powerful. Pam, I'm sure yours is just as powerful.
Hello, everybody. Nobody's ever asked me to do this before. It's usually, you do your bio and then you get on with it. I was born in Leeds in England in a very urban working class environment. After my dad died, there was just me and my sister and my mum. My mum was a tailor. The neighborhood was pretty rare. The boys carried knives to protect themselves, and the rest of us spent a lot of time scattering from various dangers within the neighborhood. My way out was I had a scholarship education thanks to my mum, who was a big believer in education, and I went on moving and was pretty determined never to go back to where I had been. But it gave me a very clear idea of what happens, how violence lives with poverty, what it feels like to be working class in a very caste-ridden society like England. I certainly understood a little bit about colonialism and racism from my mum. It certainly had a different flavor in England. I mean, it wasn't racist, just a different flavor. And I actually remember Dr. Martin Luther King being killed and my mum explaining about civil rights. And I came to the US in '85. And that's about as much as I knew. Because in English history, once you won the War of Independence, we don't really talk about the US again until about 1917, when you hauled us out during the First World War. So I arrived actually in Florida with almost no understanding, believe it or not, of any of the history of America as it related to African Americans. So it was an absolute, it sounds so silly to say that now, but it was an absolute revelation. In '85 in Gainesville, Florida, segregation had been gone for about 15 years, but it was still very clearly there. There was the other side of town. And I remember going to a doctor on the other side of town because I just looked for a doctor. I didn't look for a white doctor. I looked for a doctor, and everybody in the surgery was Black. And I was thinking, oh, this is interesting. Everybody's Black. And when I told people who were white, they were like, oh my God, you didn't go there, did you? Did you go over 8th Avenue? And that was the first time I realized that I was into something that I had absolutely no understanding of. So I lived in Florida for over 20 years. And during that time, obviously, I started to understand the history in this country as it relates specifically, honestly, to African Americans, because it is different from other cultures. It has a very, very different flavor to it. And then around the 2000s, I started to do a lot of research on neighborhoods, and I started to learn a whole set of things that I'm going to talk to you about this morning. But I think of myself still as a real novice in all this, somebody who's trying to understand what the heck happened and why, and what we do now to address what we've got because of all of the things that have happened specifically to African Americans in this country. And I'll leave it there, Shay.
Wow. Okay. We got the right women here today. Thank you. It's very powerful. Thank you. I don't even think we discussed this during our offline meeting. So
we did not.
I know, and I'm glad we didn't, because it's wow. I'm in chills from both of your guys' stories. So thank you for telling your story. So today our title is Understanding Regional Demographics, Building Your EDI Toolkit. And we're just going to forecast demographics in our regions and prepare and optimize businesses to support their workforce and communities. But outside of that, for us to support our workforce and communities. So we'll also focus on building capacity to develop new equity-centered leadership skills. So today we're going to thank you again for your great stories, Denise and Pam. We're going to go into Pam's slides, around 20 minutes for her to present. Please hold your questions because we're going to have questions at the end. We're going to go right into Denise because it flows really well into there and it's going to mix things up. Then we'll have questions. And then at the end, we're going to have some breakouts. And like I said, if it's not any much more people here, we're just going to do it right here. We're just going to have some great dialogue and questions for you guys to answer and any other questions you might have. So, but we have some questions set up. So let me go ahead and share my screen and start with Pam's slides. There we go. All right.
Yay.
Everybody see it? Do we need to make them bigger? Good.
That's fabulous. Thank you. That's great.
All right. Let me know. Next slide.
I will indeed.
Okay.
So the cover that you just saw is a needs assessment called Poverty Amidst Plenty. I have been writing that needs assessment since around 2009 in the county. It's a community needs assessment, and I do it in concert with the Community Foundation, and it really looks at every single piece of data I can get hold of around the county, quantitative data, but I also go around the county talking to hundreds of people, and I'm as likely to talk to a group of kids living in public housing as I am to the county executive or legislators. I try and get a really broad swathe that helps me collect data that backs up the quantitative data. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I'm particularly fascinated by is what they call either the social determinants or the social drivers of health. And that just basically, we keep changing terms because we like doing that, but what it basically means is where you live. And what about where you live changes your health outcomes. And so over time, and I'll show you my maps in a second, I started to realize about 2012 that there was a real pattern in our county. And first of all, I realized that it was a geographical pattern. So I could figure out, no matter what I looked at, that there were these pockets of low income and poverty level families in various parts of the county. And then I overlaid that with race and to some extent ethnicity, our Hispanic population. And I thought, oh, wait a minute, there's some patterns here. And the worst one for me was life expectancy. I looked at life expectancy and it turned out, if I looked at our poorest neighborhood where all of the social drivers were an issue, you could predict that they had 15 years less life expectancy than if I looked at one of our wealthy neighborhoods like Arnold. So all the way down to life expectancy, your outcomes are different, not just in terms of where you live, but what color you are. And when I realized that, it set me off on a whole journey of discovery with my entire county. Next slide, please. So these are just some of my maps, but I've got probably 40 of them now that track all of the social drivers of health. And they can be anything from your access to healthy food, whether you're born with a low birth weight, whether your mum had prenatal care, how you're doing in school, what your chances are of being unemployed. And no matter what, the geography and poverty matched, as did the race and ethnicity. So then I started to dig even deeper. Next slide, please. So it really, all of these disparities start early. So we start with prenatal care. My child hasn't been born yet, right? And already we start seeing these gaps. This is on the left-hand side, my left. This is the gap in prenatal first trimester care. And you can see that Blacks are far less likely, and Hispanics are less likely. And all of that that not getting prenatal care will lead to a whole set of other issues around defects, pregnancy complications, baby's growth, and so on. We also know at this stage about Black women, they're 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications than white women. And here's the horrible thing, 60% of those deaths are preventable. Next slide, please. And we look at low birth weight, babies born. And we see that African Americans are literally off the chart in low birth weight. And we start seeing the geography as well. I can predict where those babies are born, not just what color they are, and then look at the risks. So you get low birth weight like this with that big a gap. And I will tell you the Black is obviously on top, 11.3. It's almost double white. You got all the health conditions later in life, diabetes, intellectual and developmental, high blood pressure, and obesity. All those things can be tracked from low birth weight. And this is the depth of our issue. Next slide, please. So lots of other things happen in our neighborhoods at that time and going forward. Lack of access to care, lack of food, lack of places to play, a whole set of things that I'll talk about later. And by the time we get to children entering school, we actually do a test called kindergarten readiness that tells you whether your kid is ready for school or not. And look at the gap between African Americans and whites. It's bigger still between Hispanic Latinos, but remember they are also speaking English as a second language. So to some extent, you would expect that. The Black rate, very, very high. So already, we're now at 5 years of age. And here's what we know about that. That gap doesn't get any smaller in the school system. That just continues to broaden. Next slide, please. So why is early childhood a smart investment for all of you people out there? I just wanted to throw a business people. I just wanted to throw this in. Every dollar in early childhood, invest $4 to $12 in terms of your investment. Early childhood programs, your kids less likely to repeat a grade, less likely to be suspended, and they experience wonderful long-term health benefits. And you can see what happens to the investment as time goes on. If you invest in kids here in prenatal, it's a much better investment than if you invest in job training. So think about that. And let me tell you the final thing. Our African American kids are far less likely to get good quality childhood care than our white kids. And yet look what happens when children get that early childhood investment. Next slide, please. So now we're at 8th grade. I could do 3rd grade and 5th grade, but I'm going to look at 8th grade. This is English arts proficiency. These figures are old. I just haven't updated them. They're no better. In fact, they're worse because of the pandemic. Might be a bit better this year. And you will see overall rate 48%, whites at 60%. You might say, well, that's not brilliant. It's not. Blacks 28%, Hispanics 30%. That's proficiency in 8th grade. And look at math, far worse. Now, obviously, whites are not doing too good. They're at 20%. Blacks, 5%. Hispanics, 5.8%. So huge gaps now developing, purely based now, guys, on race and ethnicity. Next slide, please. So now let's go back to some of the social drivers. So we know how important food is, right? This is our access to healthy food map. It shows where the hungry people are. It shows who lives in a food desert. And here's what it also shows, although I don't have the maps to overlay this yet. The areas I'm talking about where there are the highest social drivers, the most need, that are disproportionately African American and to some extent Hispanic, they match up to the old redlining maps. So the places where we didn't allow African Americans to buy houses, the places we then decided not to put grocery stores, the places that we didn't plant trees. There's a tree canopy equity map for my areas. So that means they're much hotter in the summer, and so on and so on. Lead in the pipes in schools, much more likely to be in my areas. And then you look at the rate of insecurity for children. Food insecurity rate, 14% African American, 10% Hispanic, 8.9% white. Next slide, please. And let's look at healthcare. Whites far more likely to be insured, to not be uninsured. Blacks are at 5%. So we've got, again, this segregation. Same with Hispanics, not insured at the rate. If we did not have the Affordable Care Act, these would be much higher. And we're also an enhanced Medicaid state, Maryland, and that changes these figures. They would be much broader. But think of all the things I've talked about in terms of low birth weight, lack of access, health, etc. And now look at the diabetes rates for our county. And you will see the difference between whites and black is clearly there in diabetes rates. And I could look at every other rate. I could look at cancer rates. I could look at a whole set of other heart rates, high blood pressure rates, and you would see this same thing. Next slide, please. Gun violence is the same. So look at our crime rates, our maps, and you will see that black males had 11 times the rate of firearm injury compared to white males. Hispanics have the second highest injury rate. In the neighborhoods that I'm talking about, the level of disengagement and a whole other things, and I will talk about this with another map, really leads to a whole set of violence. It's not that the people are more violent, but I do believe that hurt people hurt people. And in my neighborhoods, we have a whole load of hurt, traumatized people. Next slide, please. So here's a way to talk about that. Some of you may have heard about adverse childhood experiences. They're the things that happen to you as a kid that you carry with you throughout your life, do damage to your system, create all sorts of hormonal stuff, cortisol, anxiety later on. And at the top of the tree, you will see that there are things like maternal depression, physical and emotional neglect, and so on. Around about 2016, a whole group of us started talking about the pair of ACEs, and we started talking about adverse community environments. And they're the places where racism, poverty, discrimination, lack of opportunity, poor housing, and violence, it's almost like the soil is not good for our children. And so those children have got a pair. They've got two sets of traumatic experiences. Next slide, please. So what do we know about those children living in our most vulnerable neighborhoods? And I can name them for you. It's Brooklyn Park 21225. It is over to West County, Fort Meade, and to some extent parts of Laurel, Maryland City. In Annapolis, it's 21401, 21403. That's where all the public and subsidized housing is. And in South County, it's down where our mobile home parks are. And they are, all of them, disproportionately African American and to some extent, to a much lesser extent, Hispanic. And what's going on in those neighborhoods? Well, low income, very low income, living in poverty, impacted by the two adverse community environments that are often caused by historic and systemic racism. Because what has happened in those neighborhoods? No investment, housing that is substandard, that was substandard to begin with. Our public housing in Annapolis, and it just burns me up every time I hear this, when it was built, they deemed it substandard. So that's what they used for public housing. So it didn't become substandard, it was substandard. And then what did they do? No trees, no places for children to play, mold, no air conditioning, and on and on and on. And they were also the places that match up to things like no grocery stores, no transportation, no way out. And remember all we talked about in terms of low birth weight and all the other things, the environmental issues, asthma. That's why asthma is so high, because of all of the other issues in those neighborhoods, diabetes, heart disease, and then we get into food access. These are the homes where people are actually rent overburdened. They are paying too much for rent. They lack transportation. Their partner might be incarcerated for all of the reasons I've just talked about. There are many economic and racial disparities. There's this whole tangle of forces going around those families. Lack of opportunity through social networks, housing disparities, not safe. We've already seen what's happening to them in the school system. We've got food insecurity. We've got lack of high quality employment opportunities. I'll show you something about that a little bit later. So a tangle of forces making our children in those neighborhoods least likely to have opportunity. Next slide, please. And then we come to the pandemic. Oh, well, that was even worse. So in my traumatized neighborhoods, there were far more deaths among African Americans, among Hispanics. There were more cases. There was more economic damage. More debt got built up. These were the folk who couldn't work at home, who had to go to work. And so coming out of the pandemic, an increased amount of trauma, more debt, more burdens in every way. So for those who could least afford to have a bad impact, they were the ones who got the worst impact from the pandemic. And I have a whole load of data that will show this. Next slide, please. So this for me is probably the most depressing statistic that I ever show anybody. And if you're not shocked by any of the other slides, the fact that over 72% of our prison population in Maryland is Black should tell you there's something incredibly wrong with the system. And if you look at the probation and parole, you will see it's 58% Black and 39% white. And remember, these are not managed for population. These are just what they are. And you think of the size of the Black population and the white population, if we don't look at anything else, we should be looking at this and saying, what the heck has gone wrong here? What has gone wrong? Next slide, please. Youth unemployment rates, you will see that Black rates are always much higher than high rates. This is a hard slide to see, I apologize, but 2.5 times the rate for a young African-American. And I saw some research actually, and I shouldn't talk about this because I haven't got time, but that showed that an African-American young man with the same qualifications as a white young man, exactly the same in every way, was something like 72% less likely to get the job. Next slide, please. Now we start looking at the racial and ethnic disparities in the workplace, and we haven't done a great job of this. So I looked at a couple of things. Our unemployment rates are still disproportionate. So African Americans are still almost twice as likely to be unemployed as whites. And then if you look at who's in what place and who's going to earn the money, you will see management, professional, and related is always higher for whites than for Blacks. Blacks are much more likely to be down in the production, transportation, and material moving, the places where you earn less money. Next slide, please. So what do we look at in the future? Well, here's the interesting thing about all this in our white world. Our white world is disappearing. As my mum always used to say to me, we're all going to be coffee coloured in the MPAM and hopefully that'll sort it all out. But I hope you can see that by 2040, whites will only be 52%. And by 2060, they will be 44%. So we've already almost got that in the city of Annapolis. City of Annapolis now is only about 52% white. Unfortunately, because that's not a trend across the US, and because of all the historic race and ethnic disparities, that's not going to solve it on its own. But it's a marker of what's to come, that in fact the white population will be in the minority, and that over time all of this will change to a much more homogenous race. But meanwhile, in 2024, we are still in every way dealing with the systemic racism that started hundreds of years ago. And we have to address it, guys. And that's just where I'm going to end. I think that's my last slide, Shay, right? Oh, no, it's not. Why would I end there when I could talk about how business can help? So I would say all of you who were brave enough to turn up today, you're starting because you're understanding and acknowledging the issue. The first thing we can do, and clearly I'm a white person, the first thing we can do is acknowledge it, right? We can't feel it because we're white, and I think it's very hard to feel it, but you can see it, you can understand it, you can acknowledge it, You can say, yep, that's happening. I think the other thing you can do is be a partner. One of the things that disproportionately impacts African Americans really immensely is transportation and childcare. Half the reason that African American women don't get the same success rate is because it's really hard when you're low income to access childcare, not just any childcare, no childcare. And then I think you can support economic development strategies to grow high opportunity industries. I think that African Americans over time, and I feel presumptuous saying this, but it's something I note, they have learned to be incredibly entrepreneurial, because when you live in an unjust world, you're constantly trying to figure out how to succeed. And I think that has naturally built a culture of entrepreneurialism. And I think we need to really encourage and support that. And if you haven't been to the African American Museum, it's so clear when you go there what the entrepreneurial spirit among African Americans has done and how much it's changed the world, not just America, but the influence of that all over the world. I really do. That's another thing you can do. Go to the African American Museum and do every floor. And then I think here's another thing. If 7% of African Americans are in prison, they are disproportionately likely to have a record. If you have a check on your application form that says, do you have a conviction? They are far more likely to have to check it. We can solve that, guys. We can change that. That's an easy one. I think looking at underemployed workers, not just people not employed, but you meet them all the time. I meet them all the time. People who you meet and you think, why are you doing that job? You're incredibly smart. So recognizing and building career ladders, and then infrastructure investments in job training, and then sector-focused workforce training, figuring out how do you lift people up who have over history been kept down? What are the ways that we can do that? So I think there's lots of conversation here for businesses. And in the end, they should be self-interested in that, especially because we have now got a real gap in the workforce because all the baby boomers retired. So as well as the pandemic. So, I mean, we really should be growing our workforce in a different and much more diverse way. And I do think that's my last slide, Shay, but you tell me if it's not. It is. Thank you, everybody. I think we're going to hold questions, right, Shay?
Yeah, we're going to hold questions. I just want to acknowledge, first of all, thank you, Pam, Dr. Brown. That was amazing information. I've seen some of that by participating with the NAACP in Anne Arundel County. I want to shout out Dr. Garrett, who's on there, we're members of NAACP. And I just want to acknowledge some of the feelings that are coming through my chat. Some people are feeling sad, angry, but we'll acknowledge all of that later. I want to acknowledge that now. But we can talk about it later, because you should feel angry. You should feel sad. You should feel whatever you're feeling is the right emotion. I felt sad. I felt like crying. I've seen these numbers in many different capacities in different organizations I'm a part of. And yeah, it's disappointing, but I'm also hopeful. So I want to leave it there and let us honor that and breathe through this before we get into, as I load Denise's slides. Please process those feelings as much as you can. But we'll have a discussion after all of this. So, but thank you, Pam. That was excellent information. I love data. I'm a data nerd. I love data.
Me too.
I just wanted to add something, Shay, if it's okay with you. And that
I'm loading the slides. Yeah. Hey, Janetta, please.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, if companies are asking questions about criminal records or arrest records, that is something in the state of Maryland I know that you cannot do. So if that is something that is happening, it shouldn't be. And maybe people should be aware of that, because a lot of people don't know. Okay, just wanted to add that while we.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay.
Appreciate that from that HR expertise you have. Thank you. All right, so now we're gonna get into Denise's presentation. You ready to go, Denise?
I am ready to go.
All right, just let me know when you want me to advance.
Okay, so I just want to go back and just say to Pam, thank you. Numbers don't lie. Numbers do not lie. And if we're gathering data, to ask the right questions. A lot of times data gets misconstrued. It is not authentic because we're not asking the right questions. And the questions that Pam posed was talking about disproportionality of the populations and how it impacts their lives according to health and education, employment, incarceration. And so what I like to move us towards is looking at, because I really want you to sit a second with what you just heard from Pam. Dr. Brown has done extraordinary homework. Extraordinary. Everybody should have a Dr. Brown in their county. And counties are scared of Dr. Browns because the truth will set you free. And the truth will liberate you. And people don't want to hear the truth because we want to have all types of excuses why inequities exist. And we don't want to look at racial inequities. And so I just want us to sit with that, because when you're approached from your various jurisdictions, when people are trying to disclaim facts that you were just shown, how do you share with them that they need to be open-minded to see what's the reality? And so what I want to transition us to is just dovetailing on what Pam shared with us, is what are key considerations for centering racial equity? If we have a new mindset, we'll get new results. So my work has been around looking at racial equity intentionally in Howard County. And people will say, can you just say equity? Why are you saying race? And everything that Pam shared with us was racially constructed, wasn't based on how people really live in the world. Like she said, people are excellent at what they do, but if you're curtailing their quality of life because of the quality of because of the color of their skin, you're missing out on having excellence really intentionally, authentically shared with everyone. And I just want to share before I go to the next slide, what I did not say in my opening is that my sister and I had a college education. My brother did not. My brother got hooked on drugs when he moved to Howard County. My father left Baltimore City to prevent that. And Howard County had drugs. My brother was addicted to heroin all of his life. And the sad end of his story is that they found my brother dead in Columbia in his apartment. That's why I do this work. We grew up in the same family, the same father and mother. My parents were together all their lives, never separated. They did their very best. And because the county did not see my brother, because there were no resources to take care of his addiction, because the school system did not see that they needed to treat him differently, because of, his being caught up. I think he has survivor's remorse. He was here with a lot of well-to-do families, and he had a great family, and then he hung around with people, and he was like, well, I get more attention doing this than I do that. So I come to you today with a sense of urgency that I don't want to see another brother like my brother die unnecessarily because of under-resourced communities, because we're not really understanding that Black folks are still suffering. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So leading with an understanding of disproportionality and disparity is part of my presentation. I'm so happy that, and I'm just, happy is an interesting word. I'm really proud that Pam inserted in her presentation the pair of ACEs. The pair of ACEs helps us to understand, and I teach this in my counseling psychology course, that when you have adverse childhood experiences, it can impact your whole life. That child in the picture there, without proper kindergarten, without proper health care, is going to be far, far behind. And if we don't have systems in place for a healthy start, if we don't have systems in place for children to have proper health care, that's when we have intergenerational trauma. And that young person there, to be able to be 34, 40 years old, has to have a miracle around them if they're going to have a quality of life. And this is even in counties that are doing very well. Next slide, please. So I'm going to break down these terms that Pam and I are using today. So disproportionality is the underrepresentation or overrepresentation of a racial or ethnic group compared to its percentage in the total population. And so the numbers that were shown earlier gave you the disproportionate aspects of being an African American, being a Black person living in America. And to have a white person break this down for you, that's what I'm saying, being part of this conversation today is amazing, because a lot of times people don't see white people doing this work. They always see people that look like me. And when we're all doing the work, we're bringing our perspectives to this work. When we look at disparity, it is the unequal outcomes of one racial or ethnic group compared to another. So how do we apply an equity lens when we have an understanding of these two terms? First, understanding disproportionality comes of outcomes of one racial or ethnic group as compared to another. So what we have been given earlier in this presentation is an understanding of why. Why does disproportionality exist? A lot of people will not have the information that Pam shared with you. And that's why they're making up things of why we don't have racism, or why do we keep talking about this? Because if you have the numbers, how are you going to walk away not understand? So bravo to this opportunity for you to understand and to have an understanding is how it impacts people of color, and particularly Black people living in America and Black people living in Maryland. Being a Black person myself, it always feels like I have to make an apology to talk about Black people. And I don't want to make any more apologies. We've got to talk about the disproportionality of Black men in prison and brown men in prison. But I'm talking about my people. We have to talk about the unequal school system, even in my county, where when I did my research and did my equity strategic planning data gathering back in 2021, everybody who I interviewed, whether they were Indian, whether they were Asian, whether they were Korean, they all said Black, white, that they moved to Howard County because of the schools. And now we see that the schools, you have to live in a certain zip code to be in exceptional school areas. Zip codes still exist. And on the bottom, how do you actively work to mitigate the factors leading to unequitable outcomes? So as leaders, you have an opportunity. I just came off of a workshop this morning before this one, because I'm running a racial equity leadership lab in Howard County government, that our leaders within housing, recreation and parks, procurement, human resources, that we have leaders that are actively engaged in learning how do you mitigate the factors of the disparities based on race and equity in your departments? And how does that impact the community that we're serving? Next slide, please. So I'm not going to be with you long. These are just some things I want you to consider. And so you can break out in your breakout rooms and have conversations that's even more meaningful than Pam and I just spewing all this wonderful research, because we want you to take this information and have conversations. So do your mission, your vision, and goals incorporate an intentional focus on reducing disproportionality and disparities? Do you say that out loud in your vision statements? Is it on your website? Is it something that's part of your value system, that you're providing equitable access and improving equitable outcomes for all? How do we do that more intentionally and place it in the verbiage of our communication? Because if your county, if your organization is not saying it out loud, they're not going to trust that you're even doing it. So the first thing is to have conversations within your organization about what is our mission? What is our vision for the next 5, 10 years? What goals are connected to our vision and our mission? And how can people see us actively doing this work? Have you led the charge to engage in activities and conversations to gain a better understanding of disproportionality and disparate outcomes in your systems? So having conversations, planning activities where you have maybe a lunch and learn. These are action item areas that as leaders, you can say, this is what I'm going to do, and put it into action. Because if people are not talking about this, if you're not showing them the stats, people are going to assume that everything is fine. People are going to assume that our budgets are going towards great, engaging programs without any strategic plan behind it. So we can't just be programmatic. And that's why DEI work has failed, because it was only doing programs without a strategy. The next question is, how do you measure responsiveness to disproportionality and disparities among historically marginalized and underserved groups? How do you measure what you're doing? A lot of programs just have these activities where you're talking about, or workshops, and then there's no measurement in how people are walking away with this knowledge. So are you constantly reviewing? Are you constantly going back to measure? How is this applying? So with our cohorts of our leadership lab, I go back and have conversations to see how are those leaders applying it in the work that they're doing, and what can we do to support them with resources, so that you're not just walking away from workshops, not truly understanding what you gain from the workshops, taking one aspect that you're going to use. And I always say you can't take care of everything. So if an aspect that you see that is disproportionate is that you have all white males as CEOs in an organization, that is something that's overrepresentation of white males that are leading. So how does that organization change that paradigm? And how do you do it in a way where everybody feels that their voices are heard? That's a hard thing to shift. I've worked in organizations where the CEO was a white male, the founding director was a white male, and then they bring a chief diversity officer in. That's a cause for disaster. 2 white males and a Black chief diversity officer, that's why things are not working. So what's wrong with that picture is that they want that person to do all the change that needs to happen without them doing the work themselves, to say, maybe I should, step down from this position. Maybe I can take another role. Maybe I need a Black woman as a CEO, or a Hispanic woman, or a Native American. How do we see our roles change because of what we see as disproportionality? How do you determine how personal biases and experiences affect decision-making during strategic planning and community engagement? A lot of folks right now are doing their strategic plans. And when people have approached me when I first came on board, I would see strategic plans and there would be one paragraph on equity. And I'm like, is that your way of saying that you're being equitable? I'm just asking a question, right? And they were like, well, this is the first time we really, okay, this is your first time. Can you amend your strategic plan? Can you go back and take a look at how do you infuse equity in every chapter instead of just one area? How have your biases kept you from seeing that you are not really infusing it? And that's why leaders need to have these workshops and these real intentional ways of learning around racial equity, because we hold biases that we're not even aware of. We hold biases when we don't see what's really actually out there. How are our processes supporting the empowerment of communities historically most affected by disparities? And when I say that because we always say, and I always try to stop people from saying vulnerable populations. Don't say they're not vulnerable. They're living in vulnerable communities. Don't underestimate their brilliance. Our mothers are brilliant in the ways that Pam talked about surviving. I mean, you've got to be creative to be poor. And so if we're not really tapping into the brilliance of our communities because of our biases and calling them vulnerable, get that word out of your mind and your heads. I tell them, take that vulnerable out. Why are you saying they're vulnerable people? They're living in vulnerable environments. That's a very big difference. And how are our processes supporting a person's need to be included, welcomed, and valued? That's how healthy and the quality of life happens with people. My father, even though he lived in Columbia, did not feel valued. When he would go to Safeway in the grocery store, he would be followed. A grown man. A police stopped him on the street when he was driving one day because of identity. You know, they thought he looked like someone else. He was targeted. And he was a citizen that wanted to be here and did not feel valued. And so when we are leaders, how do you value people who are quiet, who are introverts, who may not tell you that story? I don't tell the story of my brother all the time. I know that story in my heart, right? And so how do we allow people to tell their stories and not feel like we're going to have a sense of sympathy, no sympathy, empathy, and compassion? And so that's what I want to leave you with, these questions for us to consider with this knowledge of disproportionality and disparities. We all have a role to play to mitigate these disparities, to address disproportionalities, to be a leader and model what it means to lead with a racial equity lens. It's who I am. It's in my bio. So when people meet me, they know that's what I do. You don't have to get to talk to me too long before you know that. And so how do you show up in the world? And that's the conversation I would love for you to have. And moving to the next slide, I think that is, I want to leave you with a Dakota proverb. We will be known forever by the tracks we leave today. I threw the today in. But we will be known forever. Dr. King will be known forever. And all the women, hopefully, who were surrounding him in his endeavor. How do we lift those names up? And not just for Martin Luther King Day, but to have people that we see as our models. And someone one day will see you as a model for doing this work. And so thank you.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Denise. Wow. I'm sorry, I have to process all of that. Thank you. Thank you both. Very powerful presentations. A lot of great information. That was heavy. I have to process. I'm sorry, you guys are catching me in emotional time. But I'm so proud to just be here, part of this moment. I really am. Just thank you both, Pam and Denise. I was not expecting you guys to do that, and I'm glad I didn't have any expectations. And it was amazing. Thank you so much for your time and expertise and education and experience. You bring so much to the table. Thank you for all you're doing for Maryland, Howard County, Anne Arundel County, and I'm sure, this work is going on in other states and counties around America, but I hope they're reaching out to women like you that are setting the bar high and have great, I'm sorry, I'm processing the emotions while I'm talking, but thank you so much. So we were going to do breakouts, but Pam and Denise, I don't know if you want to do it. First of all, let me start with questions. If anybody has any questions, you can come off, you cut on your camera, your microphone, or you can put them in the chat and we can go through that for a little bit. And then we want to have you guys have some conversations, honoring that I know other people have other things to do at 11, probably other meetings and stuff. So if you have to drop off, we totally understand. And thank you for attending today. But we would love for you to hang around for another half hour to have some real deep conversations on how we can do this work, how we can, all that. So yeah, anybody have any questions before we get into any breakouts or have a conversation? Yes, ma'am. Go ahead,
I
Sonia.
have to leave.
Oh,
I'm
you have to
sorry.
leave. Go ahead.
Yeah, I
Tracy.
have to leave, but I know Denise Boston more. So great job, Denise Boston, Dr. Denise Boston. Great job as per usual, and thank you. And I do live in one of those underserved, overburdened communities, and I have a 2018 copy of Poverty Amidst Plenty that somehow I got, and I look at it all the time, and I refer people to it all the time. It's obvious that I need an updated copy, but everything you said is real. Everything you said. I live in Lothian in South County, where all those trailer parks are. So, everything you said is so for real, and we do not get the attention we deserve down here in terms of what's going on. So anything anybody can do with that would be very helpful. So sorry I have to run.
Tracy, have you got time if you put your address in the chat, I'll mail you a 2022
Okay,
version.
I will do that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks,
Thank you
Tracy.
so much.
Thank you, Tracy. All right, Sonia.
If Janetta needs to go, she can go first. I'm okay.
You're on mute.
Thank you for helping me out. I just wanted to say thank you for the information. I'm sorry I had to jump on a little late, but my hats are off to you in this world where people are trying to kill what you all are doing. They are trying to make sure that people are not getting this information. They're saying that DEI and A and B and all of that has no place in our society anymore. And you all are the brave souls that are going out there, and you're not just talking to be talking, but you're actually showing the statistics to back up what you say. And I just wanted to say that I didn't have a whole lot. I just wanted to thank you so much for that today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentations. I was wondering, both on the scale, and you can take the question wherever you'd like, of where the necessary changes are, or where things are kind of happening, either good or bad, because I'm sure there's some things that are helping, but there's also some things that aren't helping as we take a look at what you've presented to us. And I'm just curious, from both of your perspectives, where some impacts are kind of are kind of happening.
Do you want me to go, Denise? Do you want to
Go ahead.
Go. So I think there's some recognition around the disparities in maternal health. There's a lot of task forces that are getting started up around that. But honestly, Sonia, they haven't done a lot yet. And I worry that we do a lot of talking about this stuff. I think at the other end, especially for people who run businesses or who are in positions to employ people, one of the things that I've done for years now is to look at the hiring process and see how that disproportionately keeps people out. And so I have continued to hire folk and look at their experience more than their qualifications. And then when I get them in-house, find ways to move them up the ladder. So it's my own Pam Brown form of recognizing the disproportionality and then disproportionately addressing it. And I think that's what everybody has to do. You have to start looking at the bit you control and what the barriers are and what you are doing to help keep those barriers in place and what you can do to start removing the barriers. And I do believe that that works over time. My entire leadership now is African American with one Hispanic. I've got a succession plan that will be an African American person, not a white person heading the agency. So I think we actually have to all put our money where our mouth is, including me, and think about what I do in my daily work that either increases disparity or brings it down. And I can say this to you, Sonia, I am really happy when white people turn up to these things, because what tends to happen is African Americans turn up. And I can tell you, they don't need to look at my data to know this stuff. They know it in their hearts, in their bodies, in their systems. They just know it. My data is really for white people. And so when they turn up, I'm really, really happy, because it's us really we really do have to understand it and recognize it and then start changing our behavior accordingly. And I will tell you, it's really hard. It's really, really hard. And people will fight you. I mean, my county fights me about it all the time. So you've got to be prepared to find ways to not feel defeated and to continue on and do the work. You just got to do the work. And so that's what I would say. And I think we're all making headway in our own ways. And I do think that there's some look at policies now. So it's just, you just got to do the work, and we've just got to keep doing it. But I think the task force is the data. You got to have that. And now we've got to move to action. We've spent, I'm going on too long, but we have spent the last 5 years training around DEI, doing groundwater training, doing all this stuff. Now it's like, okay, now what are the fixes? Where do we start trying to address it? Every one of us in little ways, big ways. What does the county executive do? What does the governor do? And so on. Sorry, Denise, go ahead.
No, I think you speak for both of us. To know that this is an interconnected endeavor. You can't do the work alone. And so if you can find some colleagues and friends that you can have conversations with to talk about the need to do this work together, that way you won't have burnout. I work smart. I have a strategic planning team working with me. I have the Government Alliance for Race and Equity. I have ambassadors talking about this work throughout the county. I have an equity advisory committee. I've got people all around me. And people that come to me and say, I don't know anything about this. And I'm like, for you to just step in and want to do the work says everything. You'll gain the information by being in this collective. So I would say things work when we do them together and when we have diverse groups that are working alongside of each other. Because when you look at that chart in 2060, I think a lot of whites are fearful of those numbers.
I think that's true, Denise. I
and
think
if you don't do the work today to be an ally, to be supportive of us working together to generate love and compassion and empathy, no one will be left out. No one. But because of disproportionality, White people are fearful now. That's why this work is so challenging and difficult. And I understand power shifting. But if we look at power differently, if we begin to say we all have the opportunity to make change with our different privileges, we will go a long way. And I can see a 2060 where my grandchildren will see a 2060. I won't see it. And they may not even see it. I hope. But that we are, we're preparing for tomorrow, what we're doing today.
I think just to piggyback on that, one of the reasons to the point of the question, I know we've talked in our committee at the Central Maryland Chamber, and we see some of the work, and I do some of the work with businesses, is some of the statistics and the information that you share get people into that deer in a headlight of it's so enormous that I get stuck. And what we end up doing is starting that process of talking about it. But I find in this moment, a lot of people are kind of stuck of like, what can I do in those steps? And so I think, some of those pieces that you both have talked about, Pam, specifically about, walking people through a hiring process and giving them more concrete pieces so that they can start to build those blocks in their backpack to take forward with them, is where we're working in the training and development arena to help people continue the work forward.
Mm-hmm.
But they stumble a lot in this place of, I'm building my awareness, I'm not really sure how to take it to action, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think honestly, looking at criteria for hiring is really important. That is really important because that is a huge barrier because of all the education inequities, of all the social and economic inequities. So you've really got to start talking about lived experience as well as experience. It can't just be work experience. I run a social services agency, so it's easier for me because many of the people I now work with had experiences like the families we serve, right? So I think looking at that though, is there lived experience that would be really helpful to your workforce? I think that's important. Make that a criteria for hiring, So it's because all of the stuff we've got is built on the belief that this country is equitable and that people come to the hiring process, come to school. No. Kids come to school like they've got like boots on and they're expected to run the same race. Well, it's the same in the hiring process. There's not equity. So you have to think, what can I do here to acknowledge that and not add more barriers? And I think that's something for business to struggle with. And it is flipping hard because we live in this society that says academics, bachelor's degree, whatever, that's what we need in our business. Well, no, it's not actually. It really isn't.
And Pam, just off of that, are we hiring the best fit?
Exactly. Let's look at the personalities.
I'm like, what is the best fit?
Right.
So it's still the biases that's inserted in that hiring practice. The best fit is the person that is there to say, I'm going to give you my very, very best. I may not come with all these degrees, but if you look at my resume, if you look at my track record, I have been exceptional in showing up every day and being part of a team. Listen to people's stories. We don't listen to the stories. We look at a resume and credentials, not the stories. And I would also just add to that and go to the next question is that how do we retain people once they're with us?
Yeah, that's the other big thing. Retention is a big deal.
It's a big thing because if a person in these days, these younger people, they will give you a week and then they're gone.
Yeah,
they'll
they ain't
say,
playing.
I do not feel welcomed here.
Exactly.
And I'm out.
That's
right?
So true. They're not playing these
how
days.
do we retain people to say, we're going to give you all the resources that you need here. We're going to pay for your master level. I mean, where are the perks?
We're going to build a flexible schedule so you can go pick up your children. That's what you have to do. I'm afraid that's what you have to do. If you lack transportation, how can we build a part of your work that's virtual? I mean, that's what we have to do.
Awesome.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Sonia.
lady.
Great. You had us going there.
Yeah, we got off, Sonia, sorry.
I love it.
Anybody else have any questions? Catherine, Vanessa, Alexis, D Dabs, and I'm not sure of the first name.
I guess I would have a question just about in terms of incorporating DEI into strategic plans more. I know that I work at the ARC Central Chesapeake region, and we aren't reviewing our strategic plan goes till 2026. But I know, planning for 2026 will start probably next year. And in our current one, DEI is definitely incorporated as a lens through all of the different pillars of the strategic plan. But I think that there are a lot of opportunities to make it its own pillar or part of, more incorporated into everything. So I'm just kind of curious to learn more about how you would recommend, like, what are best practices around making sure DEI is centered in a strategic plan for a nonprofit or a business, I guess, but a nonprofit specifically.
I would say if you could organize a team of people who is really dedicated to looking at the organization with an equity lens, to look at what are your goals and objectives for the next 5 years, and how to infuse some equitable practices that will enable you to really talk about it more intentionally in the next phase of your strategic plan. We're looking at a racial equity strategic plan now for Howard County. I brought in a contractor, a woman's business. So when we were looking at interviewing contractors, we wanted to make sure that the contractors were diverse. And she's making history. She's a woman-owned business from Atlanta. Amazing. And she's a Black woman. And so giving her the position of helping us with our strategic plan is historic, because we had a strategic mindset about even the contract. So everything you think about has to be what are voices that we have not added to this conversation? And what types of things will we do in gathering data to give us some information about how to move forward from here? So if some departments don't have a diverse department, do we want to look at hiring? Do we want to take a look at procurement? Getting contractors. Do we want to look at budgeting? How do we look at our budget? So all of those factors, a team that can really work together to bring that team collective knowledge to the strategic planning team. It could be 2 different teams. So I have a racial equity strategic planning team that's working with the contract, because the team has historical knowledge of the county. The contractor is an outsider. So we have both teams working together to bring a collective mindset around it. And by the end of this year, we're hoping to have our strategic plan for 2025, 2028. And a lot of people who are part of the team could never imagine themselves being a part. They were like, I never thought I'd be a part of a strategic planning team. It seems so enormous. It seems so daunting. Like, everybody's experience is important. So I'm always encouraging people to lean in to something that they've never done before. And that's how you learn.
So I would just say data, Catherine, in every way. So in the people you serve, your clients, there are a whole load of disparities in disability data. But then in your organization, at what level are people at? Are all of the African Americans at the bottom? Is there disparities in the levels? What's going on, and is there a plan? Can you make a plan? So I think that's it. If you start with data that's unassailable, and it always is, and it's always there, I would always recommend that people lead with data and talk about that, and it's sort of a safe place, because data is what it is.
Thank you, Catherine. Anybody else have any other questions? Look like we lost a lot of people, so no breakout rooms, which is fine. We had some great conversations here. So Yeah, I think I might just go ahead. Well, we will send out a wrap-up email after this with a toolkit. Thanks to Olivia, she put together a beautiful toolkit, which will have the presentations, contact information for our presenters, as well as I think we're going to throw in the questions. I'll share those with you, Olivia, so you guys can start having these the questions Pam and Denise provided to me, so you can have these conversations not only with yourself, but with your communities, your networks, your businesses, your organizations. So I think that'd be great. So before we wrap up, I would love to get any final thoughts or wrap up from Pam and then Denise.
Well, mine's just a thank you. I'm always so grateful when people show up, and I'm specifically glad that there are white people here. I think it's really important that we all struggle with this data because it's real. And then we have to figure out what's our bit and what we can do and how we can educate other people, frankly. So I'm really very, very appreciative. You've taken an hour out of your schedule, all of you, to really struggle with something that is massively difficult. It's really, really difficult. So thank you very much. Denise?
And thank you, Pam, for being a great co-conspirator in all of this.
That's us.
Without your data, I could not have stood alone. So data is everything. I mean, I could have done my thing, but having data in front of us to let us know what the realities are for so many people in the world who are struggling. It's so important. Data drives everything. And then once we have data, we have to do something with it. Data can't sit on a shelf. We can't use that as an excuse to say, well, we did the surveys, we did focus groups. No, it has to go beyond that. And so Shay, thank you for inviting me. I talk all the time. I'm one more thing to talk about, but it was a pleasure being here because the more I share, the more I know how important this work is. And the more I know that I am not going to be here forever. So whatever I can pass on from my knowledge, from what I've gained is just a blessing. And I'm just grateful that I can pass this on so that I don't have to do this work forever. I want to sit back and watch other people. I want to bear the wonderful, wonderful influences of us doing this work as an elder. So I'm preparing for my eldership by doing this work.
Me too. Bring on the eldership.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm sure both of you, I know both of you ladies are going to leave a legacy, have already left a legacy of information, of data, of just change, right? And hopefully we will affect positive change in this nation, starting with our counties, our cities, our zip codes, and just moving on from there. So just thank you both for your time today. Again, it's just brilliant. Just amazing, emotional. I'm just so proud and happy to be here today. And we'll be sharing more information, like I said, in a follow-up email. And I just thank everyone for their time. So have a wonderful day. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
Bye.